Hello and welcome to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and geopolitics. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer over at War on the Rocks, and I'm joined by none other than Michael Kaufman at your new office at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace. Mike, thanks for having me in your office.
Thanks for coming by and for hosting the podcast. Sorry for the lack of any kind of decor because I haven't really quite moved in here yet. It's about as bare an office as one can imagine, but it is a lovely space downtown in Washington, D.C.
It's been a while. You recently returned from Ukraine from a research trip, and you have talked about that over on your own podcast, The Russia Contingency. But for everybody, I'd say there are three axes of advance, right? So what's the military situation as you see it in Ukraine, and how's it going?
I think the honest answer is that we were able to get a lot of insight into what's been taking place in both the offensive and the opening days of it. I think right now the situation kind of varies between three different sectors. So in terms of the main axis of advance, first you have Bakhmut. Bakhmut, I think initially was meant much more as a fixing action to draw Russian forces there starting in the middle of May. The Ukrainian military has made the most progress in around Bakhmut. They don't have Russian forces in encirclement, although I've heard declarations to that effect for almost the past 2 months, but they are making significant gains. They are starting to seize the town of Klishivka on Bakhmut's southern flank, which is an important town and could be a turning point in the fight for that flank in the battle. A lot of the Russian airborne is being attrited over time in Bakhmut. And the reason for that is the Russian military has not had time to dig in and around the city. The battlefield has been fluid there going back and forth since December. The units that are there are kind of a motley crew of airborne, volunteer units that are generated from various Russian companies, organizations. And it's a kind of like a motley crew in terms of what that core represents fighting around Bakhmut. And the Ukrainian forces are a fairly cohesive set of very experienced brigades, 24th, 28th, 3rd Assault, 80th, 5th, and they're quite motivated. And so these units have been steadily eating away at the Russian positions, and the Russian military doesn't enjoy fire superiority around Bakhmut either. And, I think a significant percentage of Russian units are out there quite tired. And the geography of the battlefield, it's not especially favorable to Ukraine, but it's not favorable to the Russian military either. If you look further south, which is where the main offense has been taking place, you had one axis of advance from Velika Novosilka pushing down towards Berdyansk. When the Ukrainian military had a few days of gains at the beginning of the offensive starting early in June, it stalled out around Makarovka, which was just a few towns further south. And now they've progressed just slightly past Makarovka to the next town over. But, that being what it may, I think that axis is ultimately secondary in the offensive operation. It was meant to strain Russian forces and create a dilemma for them. I think it's fair to say that in the last 7 weeks, the Ukrainian military has not progressed significantly on that axis. Although, as always, when we look at progress, measuring it by territorial gains can be a lagging indicator because the balance of attrition is very important as well. And I think as many who have followed this war know that after the initial assault, which was not successful in substantially breaching Russian lines, Ukrainian forces switched to an attritional approach, and they've been on the ground fighting in largely small-scale action, that is platoon-sized attacks, fighting tree line to tree line, occasionally employing company-level formations, but using their advantage in artillery fires, their qualitative advantage in precision-guided munitions, to go after Russian artillery. And it does seem that the balance of attrition, anecdotally, appears to be favorable to Ukraine, which is significant because the attacking side typically takes greater losses. But on the other hand, the Russian military may have greater force availability overall, and most importantly, can steadily retreat into prepared defensive lines. Much of the fighting has been, for lack of a better word, in kind of the crumple zone, that is the initial Russian line of defenses, without yet reaching the main line of defense, or just in a few areas, just a few kilometers shy of it. All right. Well, that takes us to, I think, what increasingly appeared to be the main effort, which is the axis of advance from Orikhiv pushing south and trying to get around Tokmak, both northeast of Tokmak at Robotine and southwest of Orikhiv along towns like Petyihatki and sort of closer to the actual Dnieper River. So there, the initial breaching attempt by 47th Brigade, 33rd Brigade, and other supporting units like 128th Mountain, 65th, well, it wasn't particularly successful. And it then led to the slog and an incremental advance. Ukrainian forces have made some progress around Robotina at this point, still a few kilometers shy of the first defensive belt the Russian forces have behind these lines. On the western side of this fight, the side that's closest to the Dnieper River, what I think we've seen most recently is increased commitment of Ukrainian forces. And that while the initial fight was led by the 9th Corps and the units associated with the 9th Corps, the 10th Corps, which was meant to be the second echelon force, has now been committed. Or at least seems to have been committed to a large extent as the brigades associated with the 10th Corps. And my own interpretation is the reason for that is that the 9th Corps spent the better part of 7 weeks trying to get to the main Russian line. I don't think they were successful, but maybe it's fair to say they were partially successful in trying to attain that goal. But there's a good chance that at this point, 10th Corps has been thrown in to get the rest of the way there and to try to break through the main Russian lines. And so in the coming days, we may see what comes of that, whether or not there's a substantial change in the line of control, or if what happens with the units that 10th Corps is thrown into this battle is very similar to what happened with 9th Corps.
So I think for savvy listeners who have listened to you talk about this a lot, and I'm one of them because I oftentimes interview you, is that the axes of advance and the towns that you're talking about are pretty similar from when this offensive began. And I think that leads to natural questions about whether or not this offensive has failed. Now, I think you're going to say it has not failed because you don't know. But for skeptical listeners who are saying, I keep hearing the same towns, what explains, I guess, the slow rate of advance on the Ukrainian side? And is this a reflection of a well-prepared Russian defense?
Sure. So first on the question whether it's failed. Yes, my answer is that it hasn't. Certainly not yet. But it's very clear that 7 weeks into it, it's not gone to plan. To say that it's behind schedule or anticipated timelines is to put it very mildly and politely. I think that probably a significant percentage of the Ukrainian force has already been committed in various shape or form, piecemeal, to this fight. I don't think Ukrainian reserves have been thrown into the fight. I think there's probably at least 3 forces, a first echelon, a second echelon, the reserve force. But I have increasingly seen Ukrainian units being involved to do the job that other units were supposed to do, while they were supposed to do a follow-on task, right? So it's not failed, but it's not been especially successful either. The U.S. decision to provide DPIC and cluster artillery munitions to Ukraine will prevent this offensive from culminating early because it will alleviate the main constraint on Ukrainian forces, and they'll be able to probably prosecute it into the fall. Because artillery ammunition creates a very significant outer boundary for how long this offensive can go on, along with the effective combat power that Ukrainian forces can throw against it. So why has it gone so slowly? There are 2 principal reasons. The Russian defenses, particularly in the initial line of defense, were quite strong and stronger than expected. Overlapping minefields, anti-tank, anti-personnel, a lot of anti-tank guided missiles deployed forward in the initial lines, attack helicopters. Ukrainian forces have a shortage of enablers or breaching equipment, short-range air defense. It's very hard to get to a minefield, even when you have the equipment. Breaching equipment gets killed very early on. It's a priority target. Soldiers are very slow to advance because minefields have a sticky effect. When soldiers know that they're traversing a minefield, they operate and act differently. And infantry attacks is very slow to advance, 100 meters at a time. And then who's going to bring up logistics and supply? Most people on foot. So vehicles are in many respects out of this fight. It's very hard to sustain momentum. And because of that, it's very hard to have something like a breakthrough because you're just pushing Russian forces and you're pushing them back, but you're pushing them back onto further prepared lines. Russian military is regenerating minefields with distance mining, deploying butterfly mines with multiple launch rocket systems. And of course, they're digging more trenches, deploying additional mines. But their forces are also being attrited on the line. And it's not clear to what extent they have a sufficiently robust reserve to maintain a defense in depth. I don't think that all the Russian military is forward. I think they probably do have echelon lines and staggered in terms of how their units are deployed. But I think that the force that they have available overall to defend in the south is, I think the fairest way to describe it is one that also takes on significant risk. In the sense that I don't think they're flush with reserves, and certainly not with operationally ready reserves. Okay, but there's another side to the story, which I've discussed on the Russia contingency with Rob Lee and friends Stefan Gatti and Conrad, which is that while the offensive itself hasn't failed, it's pretty clear that the new brigades have not been successful. By and large, experienced units allocated to this offensive and the more experienced brigades fighting in Bakhmut have consistently done and performed better without Western equipment than Western-trained brigades. The new brigades lack unit cohesion. They lack sufficient brigade staff training to know how to use different parts and components of the brigade. They were given a very difficult task, an assault task, early on. And I think it's fair to say that most of them performed poorly. And some performed very poorly in how they execute this task. It's not just a question of running into Russian mines and the extent of Russian defenses. There's also a question of taking new units that have only had a few months of training and attempting to employ them in such a difficult, high-risk mission. Now, some might argue, what else could Ukraine have done? And I think the honest answer is Ukraine could have pulled more experienced brigades off the line, given them the Western equipment, and given them the primary task of assaulting the Russian defenses, or generated additional battalions in those units. But without digressing in this path of conversation, let's say there were options, but this was the strategy pursued, and the strategy was not initially successful, which is why the Ukrainian military adapted, right? This didn't work. Another issue worth raising, I think there is to some extent a cognitive dissonance, in that I think some folks in the West, looking at Ukrainian army corps and brigades, believe that these can be committed the way the United States would commit brigade combat teams. And what they don't appreciate is that the Ukrainian capacity for force employment on the offense is quite constrained. And so a brigade in action is typically 2 reinforced companies advancing with artillery support, maybe 3, and that's about what it amounts to. And it's very hard for the Ukrainian military to coordinate offensive action higher than the company level. And it's very hard for them to engage in combined arms maneuver that is integrating effects between infantry, armor, artillery at even something like a company level. And so I think some of the expectations of what the Ukrainian forces can do, how they can employ their forces, are somewhat misplaced. Or at the very least, I think there's a difference in perceptions. And so because of that, I think the Ukrainian military has effectively switched to what works for them. And so my argument has been that the best thing that the United States and other countries can do is not trying to get Ukraine to fight the way we might fight without really the necessary training, without the process it would take to convert into that kind of tactical approach and that manner of force employment, but to resource the Ukrainian military in fighting the way they best know how. Especially since we already tried the other option. And the results, I think, are plain for everyone to see.
So you raised something about echelons of Ukrainian forces, and perhaps the first echelon of Ukrainian forces have been committed to this offensive thus far. That raises the question about second and third echelons that could come, particularly if this devolves, and I think it has, into an offensive of attrition, let's call it, where attrition is the primary mechanism for combined arms maneuver. That's the first question. The second question is, way back when you first started this, War on the Rocks podcast feature with Ryan, you were one of the first to ferret out that the Russians would have to do more mass mobilization of their people. What do you think it looks like on the Russian side in terms of their levels of attrition? I do realize it's hard to understand in terms of their ability to absorb the Ukrainian offensive.
So regarding echelonment, I think on the Ukrainian side, you have, at least for the main push from Orikhiv south towards Tokmak and Melitopol, you probably have at least 3 sets of forces, right? And you have the regular units also supported by National Guard brigades. 15th National Guard Brigade supporting 9th Corps, 3rd and 14th National Guard brigades supporting 10th Corps in this action. And I think it's also fair to say that we haven't seen all the new brigades employed up until maybe about this morning, but it does look like the remainder of the newer units available to 10th Corps have been used in some way, shape, or form. And the truth is that probably over the past month, elements of 10th Corps have been piecemeal fed into this fight to replace 9th Corps, as it's been attrited out. And some 9th Corps brigades were, I think, pulled off the line for weak performance. The general consensus has been that, of course, these units can learn. They've gained experience. They've been bloodied in combat. They can adapt over time. But that is a very, very tough adaptation cycle to go through, especially when you have a daunting task of taking out Russian defenses, and that the more experienced units have been making more of the gains and have performed a lot better without Western equipment, which leads me to my own intellectual bias as an analyst that the conversation typically should be, about force employment concepts, ideas, then about people. People are very, very important. And lastly, about stuff. The brigades without the Leopard 2A6s are making many of the gains around Bakhmut and in the south, and the brigades with the Leopard 2A6s are not. Okay, and the same can be said about other Western tech that was sort of advanced as Wunderwaffen that was going to cut through Russian lines. Western equipment has proven to be far more survivable. Ukrainian casualties are much lower because of our equipment. It's capable of nighttime operations, although Ukrainian units much less so in practice because of a lack of training. Many of the mistakes I think happen are the sort of things you would see in training, but you just wouldn't take a unit with 3 months of training that's not a cohesive unit that hasn't gone through it, and when you have to do that and put them in a breaching role like this, some of the things that happen I think were not surprising. Okay, regarding Russian forces. So I don't think that the way Ukraine is pursuing this battle is necessarily pulling apart the Russian military as a defensive system, and that includes the long-range strikes using Storm Shadows and Scalp EGs, but it is attriting the Russian military. The Ukrainian military has a relative advantage and a relative superiority in artillery fires, tube artillery, not MLRS rocket artillery. The Russian military has been conserving ammo. It was very clear to us at the front that a lot of predictions that were being made that the Russian military would have to ration artillery use, they came true. But I think part of the challenge is that the Russian military likely has a lot more artillery than actually has ammo to use it. So you can destroy a lot of Russian artillery pieces, but their biggest issue is ammo. Secondarily, a lot of Russian counter-battery fire is using Lancet 3 munitions, guided munitions, and of course FPV drones, and of course attack helicopters. Plus, they're also using fixed-wing aviation, dropping glide bombs at Ukrainian infrastructure and at Ukrainian units to the extent that they can target them. So on the Russian military side, I think they're definitely on the worst end of the attrition curve, but I don't believe that the Russian line is overall very thin or that they lack reserves. In terms of the Dnipro grouping of forces and some of the other units, I still think they have some forces available that could be attrited out over time. You could see a gradually then suddenly effect take place. But at the way Ukraine is forced to somewhat drip feed combat power into the battlefield, it's very hard to achieve breakthrough or the kind of dilemma you impose on your adversary or shock effects. And some of the shock effect was frankly lost in the initial assault. Because once Russian forces saw that, the Leopard 2 tank is more capable, but it is defeated by mines and anti-tank guided missiles like any other tank, then the perception of much better Western equipment and the potential shock it might have began to fade. All that being said, I think the Russian military is also a bit in a precarious position. And so it remains to be seen how this plays out. I honestly think in the next couple of days, the situation will be clearer. If 10th Corps is substantially put into this fight, we will have at least hard evidence as to what can happen or can't happen with the employment of a second echelon of forces. And that will help set expectations for what we're going to see in August, September, and October. So I think to some extent, the course of the offensive, the jury's still out. Naturally, based on the last 7 weeks, I'm more pessimistic than I was at the outset. And I don't think there's any other way to look at it. But Ukraine has adapted to an extent. It's pursued an attritional strategy that's worked for it in the past. And even though this is slow and costly and it's not great for making headlines, if if the West can resource the strategy, it can create real problems for the Russian forces. I just don't know if they can achieve their objectives in the offensive, pursuing it this way. That is to say, I think they will definitely make gains. I think they will be able to get through some Russian lines. I don't know if they'll be able to get to their strategic objectives. That remains in question.
Well, Mike, since you brought up some of your other conversations, particularly your field work in Ukraine, I wanted to take this opportunity to let listeners know that if they want to learn more about your field work, particularly in-depth discussions about your time at the front, your visit to Bakhmut, and as well as other observations of analysts that went with you to Ukraine, they can head on over to the Russia Contingency, which is your own personal podcast, which is for War on the Rocks members at warontherocks.com/membership. So I guess the question that everybody will have, this is a natural segue, is that people will say, well, if it's bogging down into a level of attrition that perhaps favors Ukraine, but not decisively so, is what would it take to tilt the balance? And I think this is where people want to fill in sort of that extra airspace with F-16s. They need air superiority. They need to fight like the U.S., and that they, quote unquote, can't win unless that they change the way that they fight. And I know that you just got back from Ukraine. What are your thoughts on this? And, what are your thoughts in general about this idea about air superiority and its necessity to move forward with this offensive?
So I think what Ukrainian forces want really depends who you ask in Ukraine, right? The units involved in the action, what they want are man-portable forms of clearing minefields, things like APOBs that we have. A lot of our support and the equipment we provided was based around the idea of a combined arms mechanized assault. That has not demonstrated results, so it needs to orient much more towards the infantry dismounted fight, okay? The same can be said about enabling Ukraine's qualitative advantage, providing Ukraine with better means of ISR on the battlefield, drones. Ukrainian forces need mobility. They need trucks, they need pickups, okay? I've spent pretty much all my time in Ukraine and in some form of unprotected vehicle or another. I think in this last visit, I fell in love with a Toyota Hilux. Previously, it was some other Toyotas or Nissans, but Ukrainians very much need whatever mobility is available. They need replacement parts. They need the ability to produce their own. Defense industrial production is a big issue. They can repair and fix a lot on their own. They need 3D printing machines. They need the actual licensed production capacity to do it themselves. Most of what the units ask for, things like night vision, for example, you have units that only have a few night vision sets. It's a lot of the basics. And for Ukraine writ large, it's ammo. The top priority is ammo. Artillery shells, tank shells, particularly explosive charges for various kinds, and small arms ammo as well. So it comes down to that. But your question on F-16, so that's an important one. So I think F-16s are fundamentally seen as a long-term transition program, right? I don't see any way they can be relevant to the fight this year. And while important, they're also to some extent a red herring, which is that F-16s in any practical fashion, they're going to enter this battlefield, it'll probably be in 2024, and not for this offensive. But I think it's important to have a broader conversation. It's been often said that, well, Ukraine doesn't have air power, and that it cannot doctrinally perform the way the West would. Okay, that's very true, but having air power doesn't mean being able to attain air superiority at all. In fact, a lot of expectations for what Western air power can do are largely based on the performance of only two air forces, the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. If you base your expectations off of what Western air power can do by watching what European air forces could do in Libya in 2011, you might not come to the same conclusions, okay? Just to be very blunt about it. Second, the kind of air power and the capacity to employ it in this manner that Ukraine would need is going to be a multi-year transition. Yes, Ukrainian forces can assimilate Western technology a lot faster and better than other militaries, and better than people expected. But as the performance of new units showed early on in this campaign, you cannot short-circuit actual training for unit cohesion, for staff, and the capacity to coordinate the different combat arms and different elements of the unit is not something that can be done on a much shorter timeline. It's very different to train someone to drive a Leopard tank than to be able to create a battalion that's capable of action as a cohesive unit. And the same issue applies to aviation, right? We'll put aside the issue of integrating F-16s, of maintaining them and all those details. They're nuances, but they can all be solved for. Here's the fundamental issue. It is much harder to coordinate air-land battle, that is, coordinate air power with land power, than it is just to coordinate land power. The Ukrainian military struggles to coordinate land power at scale. So the expectation that they will be able to go from this challenge to a much more difficult challenge, be able to employ air power effectively, attain air superiority against a quantitatively superior air force, but more importantly, against a military that has extensive integrated air defenses, which most Western militaries probably would not be able to do without direct assistance from the United States. Look, I'm sorry, but to me, this argument sounds pretty unrealistic and not very well based in facts. I think that air power would add a lot to Ukrainian capabilities. I think F-16s would, but again, if you look at the F-16s that Ukraine is getting, there are a lot of assumptions being made about the upgrades that will be provided for those F-16s as well. F-16s by themselves, particularly some of the older ones that they're likely to receive, are not exactly the most competitive platform of today's age, just to be blunt about that as well. So, attaining air superiority, maintaining air superiority, being able to employ air power effectively in coordination with a ground offensive, these are pretty complex tasks for a military to be able to take up. I'm confident the Ukrainian military could do all of them. I do not believe it would be able to do all of them in a period of a few months, or even get there on a timeline of, let's say, something like a year. And folks who believe that the Ukrainian military can be converted to a Western way of war really need to check in on what happened, at least in the early weeks of this offensive. And I think it's a much smarter and more efficacious option, at least right now, for this war, to better enable Ukrainian military to fight the way it knows how to, and to play to its advantages and strengths, and to focus on transferring F-16s to the Ukrainian Armed Forces, but understanding that that is meant to be a long-term capacity building program, providing them a more capable, let's say, Air Force, but not as an intellectual alibi. And lastly, and this is the last point on the subject, but it's important, Western militaries are structured and funded such that air power constitutes a substantial percentage of their military power and the fires they bring to the battlefield. The Ukrainian military is a successor military to the Soviet army. It is structured around decisive use of land-based fires, with a very substantial artillery and long-range precision strike component. This has been provided to Ukraine by Western countries and by the United States. The United States has effectively resourced for the first time in this fight in providing the Ukrainian military a degree of superiority in artillery fires. So it is true, Ukrainian military does not have the benefit of air power. It's also true that probably many Western militaries who had air power might not do significantly better, although, we should always disassociate what the U.S. might do with what some other Western militaries might do. But it's also not the case that the Ukrainian military was dependent or structured around the decisive use of air power in combat or the attainment of air superiority in combat operations. To be clear, the Russian military actually isn't either. And this is a separate conversation, but there are concrete reasons for the weak performance of Russian airspace forces in the opening of this war as well, because they also do not train and organize around certain missions and tasks. So my whole point in this conversation is just to say that the fact that Ukraine doesn't have the benefit of air power is true, but there are a lot of assumptions and ifs being strung together around the notion of what might happen if Ukraine has 16s and the kind of effects you'd be able to generate from them. And I'm not sure they're actually here or there for this offensive. To be frank, it was very clear what Ukrainian military did or did not have available in advance of this offensive operation. That's why analysts like myself and others were very upfront, writing many, many months in advance, saying that this would be costly, it would be difficult, and the outcome would be uncertain.
So I guess the final question here is, people are going to be listening to this whenever they get to it, right? And so for transparency's sake, we're recording this on Wednesday, July 26th at about 3:30 in the afternoon, East Coast time. It'll probably come up a day or two later. Things obviously are fluid and change over the next 48 hours between recording and posting. Where should people be watching if they come on to this podcast, maybe in, say, 72 hours, for I guess, direction about where this offensive is going?
So if you're looking at the main offensive in the south, I would be looking around Robotyne and at potential Ukrainian advances northwest of Tokmak, not far from the Dnieper River, and to see how the brigades associated with 10th Corps perform, to what extent they are able to push Russian forces to the main line. Are they able to breach the main first defensive belt, although there are several there? And at the end of the day, this is a lagging indicator, obviously, the changing of territorial control, but it is nonetheless an important one. And also to see what the reaction from Russian forces is. I think that it'll be clear within the next couple of days. And that's why, up until this point, I've typically said that I don't believe the new brigades have performed as expected. I have not necessarily validated the concept behind them. But the jury's still out until we see the remainder of these units as employed by 10th Corps in a second echelon. And I think it was always fair to give the other units that had not had a substantial role yet in the fight a chance to show themselves, for at least speaking as an analyst. As an analyst, you want to try to have the evidence in before you make the judgment calls, right? It's always better that way. Looking around Bakhmut, I think it's pretty clear that Ukrainian forces will steadily capture the town of Klishivka. The one area I didn't touch on early on in discussion, I think I omitted this, but it's worth mentioning, is that during the past, let's say, week or so, the Russian military has taken advantage of the fact that the bulk of Ukrainian forces are focused on fighting around Bakhmut and in the south, right? But some of the inexperienced units or perhaps weaker units were deployed to hold the defensive line around Svatova Kremina. This is generally near Luhansk and the Kharkiv area. And the Russian military has attacked there and seized the initiative. They were able to attain a minor breakthrough, pushing from Kremina west of several kilometers, and had similarly organized a push north of it. And so they are making gains. I would say it's a localized offensive, but it's taking advantage of the fact that the units there are fairly weak, and the Ukrainian military logically cannot be strong everywhere, right? If priority 1 is Orikhiv, and priority 2 is Velika Novosilka, and 3 is Bakhmut, somewhere there have to be weaker units that don't have enough fires, don't have enough support, that are basically put there, and I think the Russian military is taking advantage there. That said, I suspect the Ukrainian forces will bring up reserves and will stabilize the situation, but it's true that the Russian military on one part of the front has made some gains. You know, and to be frank, when compared to Ukrainian gains along the southern offensive, those two are also can be counted in a few kilometers here and there. But the Russian offensive, I think, up north is mostly aimed at drawing the Ukrainian military probably from Bakhmut and relieving pressure from Bakhmut and taking advantage at the current disposition of Ukrainian forces. So that's my take on it. That's a developing situation. So I think today it's worth looking at the south to see what happens with employment of 10th Corps units. It's worth looking around Bakhmut and what happens with Klishivka and another town that's being contested. And it's also worth keeping an eye on the north, understanding that may not necessarily develop into anything strategic in terms of gains for the Russian military, but notable that they seized initiative there and that they are conducting their own, let's say, minor offensive or localized attack that has had some success. At least I was surprised by it, and I think they took advantage of weaker units defending in that area.
Well, Mike, I think we're going to leave it there. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind listeners one last time that you go into far more depth and detail about your research and your findings from your research trip to Ukraine. It was your third, right?
Yeah, this was our third visit, and I think each time we've gone, it's become better organized. I definitely want to thank elements of the Ukrainian military for supporting this, for helping make it happen. And obviously, I'm very thankful to all the folks we engage with. I don't think they listen to this podcast, to be perfectly honest. I'm sure they're busy fighting, but I think they're very much in our thoughts. And over the course of these trips, we met quite a few people. We met quite a few units, from the offensive in Kherson to the battles around Bakhmut and the Donbass, and now in the south. And we've engaged with them throughout. And some of them have been killed. They've been killed in action between these different battles. and other folks we reconnected with. We were last with them in Bakhmut, and this time around we were with them in Orikhiv. And so, I myself have formed quite a few personal connections resulting from these trips.
Well, I guess there's no great way to say it, but to learn more about these trips and your personal connection to Ukraine, and also far more detail and in depth about certain weapon systems and platforms that are involved in the offensive, as well as you and I talking about Russian nuclear history, going back to the Soviet era, and all sorts of weird tangents about Soviet and Russian history, head on over to warontherocks.com/membership, where you can sign up and gain access to Mike's personal podcast, The Russia Contingency. With that, Mike, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for hosting.